At 63 years old, I was standing in my own backyard holding a garden hose when my son-in-law walked out the back door and told me I needed to find somewhere else to live. Not asked, told. He had his arms crossed and his chin slightly raised, the way men do when they've rehearsed something and don't want to lose their nerve. My daughter stood behind him in the kitchen doorway. She didn't say anything. That was the part I couldn't shake afterward. Not what he said. The fact that she already knew. My name is Warren Slade. I'm 63 years old, retired from 31 years as a civil engineer, and that Tuesday afternoon in April I had grass stains on my knees from pulling weeds along the fence line of a house I'd helped pay to renovate. The gutter above the garage was mine. The concrete pad where their minivan sat, I'd poured that with my brother-in-law 3 summers ago. On a weekend we'd called a project and turned into something closer to a party. 2 cases of beer and a borrowed mixer, and we'd laughed about it for years. None of that seemed to matter anymore. My daughter and her husband had moved back to Clover Ridge 2 years earlier. He'd been laid off in Atlanta, she'd been pregnant with their second, and they needed space to regroup. The house they moved into was the one my wife and I had owned outright since 2009. We offered it at below market rent. We thought we were helping. I thought I was helping. My wife had passed 3 years before that. Cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. After she was gone, I'd rattled around in our other house, the one we'd retired to on the edge of town, for about 8 months before my daughter suggested I move into the garage apartment connected to their house. Stay close, she'd said. We'll look after each other. That's what she'd said. Look after each other. The apartment wasn't much. A single room, a bathroom, a small kitchen counter with 2 burners. I'd insulated it myself one October. I kept my drafting table in the corner even though I didn't draft anymore. Old habits. I had my wife's photograph on the windowsill and a coffee maker that took 4 minutes longer than it should have. I'd meant to replace it. I never did. For a while, it worked. I had breakfast with grandchildren on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. I fixed things when they broke. The dishwasher, the porch step, the latch on the back gate that kept swinging open. I was useful. I felt it. Then my son-in-law's brother came to visit. He was supposed to stay 2 weeks. That was the original plan. 2 weeks turned into 6. 6 turned into 4 months. He slept in the spare room, ate their food, and occupied the house in the particular way of men who have nowhere pressing to be. He was 38 years old and between situations, which was how my son-in-law described it. Between situations. I didn't say much at first. It wasn't my house in the strict sense anymore. I'd signed the deed over to my daughter when they moved in. Her name, her asset, her stability. A decision my attorney had called straightforward and that I'd called love. She'd cried when I handed her the paperwork. Said she'd never forget it. I believed her because I wanted to. The friction started small. My son-in-law's brother used the outdoor spigot on my side of the fence to wash his truck every Saturday morning. Not a problem in itself. But he'd leave the hose stretched across the walk and I'd trip on it going to get my newspaper. I mentioned it once, politely, through my son-in-law. The next Saturday, the hose was there again. I started going around the other way. Then one evening I came in for dinner. My daughter had been having me over on Sunday nights since I moved in, and he was already at the table. My chair, the one at the end closest to the kitchen, was taken. A small thing. I sat on the side instead and told myself it didn't matter. It didn't, really. But something about it stayed with me longer than it should have. The conversation that evening circled around him the way conversations do when there's someone new in a house who commands attention through sheer presence. He talked about deals he was working on, vague things with no timelines. My son-in-law laughed at his stories. My daughter smiled in the careful way she does when she's managing something. I drove back to the apartment that night and sat in the dark for a few minutes before going inside. Not dramatic. I wasn't upset. Just noticing something that didn't have a name yet. The following month, it got a name. My son-in-law called me on a Wednesday afternoon. Not a knock on the apartment door the way we usually did things. A phone call. I should have read that. He said he and my daughter had been talking. He said things were feeling cramped. He said having 2 separate households on one property was creating tension. I'd later find out he meant his brother felt watched, which was rich, considering I'd spent 6 months avoiding eye contact across a fence, and that they thought it might be better if I looked into other arrangements. I asked what kind of arrangements. He said something about senior living communities. There was a nice one over in Millhaven. He'd looked into it. Some had independent units with their own kitchens. I was 63 years old. I had not had a single health incident. I still ran 3 miles on Wednesdays. But I said, very quietly, that I understood and that I'd think about it. When I hung up, I sat at my drafting table and looked out the window at the backyard I'd helped landscape. The oak we'd planted for my wife when she was still well enough to hold the sapling upright. Still there. Taller now. I called my son, my actual son, who lived in Raleigh and worked in hospital administration. I didn't tell him everything that night. I gave him the outline. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Dad, do you want me to come down?" I told him no. Not yet. I needed to think first. I needed to understand what exactly had just happened. Because here's the thing they don't tell you about being dismissed quietly. It doesn't feel like an explosion. It feels like a slow leak. You keep checking to see if the room is getting smaller, and you can never quite catch the moment it did. Over the next week, I did something I hadn't done in years. I got methodical. Engineer's habit. I made a list of what I had, what I didn't, and what I needed. I had my pension. I had a modest savings account I'd maintained separately from the house transfer. I had Social Security. I had a truck and a storage unit with my wife's furniture in it, and a drafting table and a coffee maker that took too long. I didn't have a place to live that was mine. I also did something else. I called my attorney, the same one who'd handled the deed transfer 3 years before. He picked up on the second ring. We talked for 40 minutes. He confirmed what I'd already half known. The house was legally my daughter's. I had no tenancy rights because we'd never formalized my occupancy in writing. A handshake and a family understanding. My attorney didn't say "I told you so." He's too professional for that. But I heard it in the pause before he started explaining my options. I asked him one question before I hung up. Did I have anything in writing about the renovation work I'd done? The concrete, the gutter, the insulation? He asked why. I said I just wanted to know what existed. That week, I went back through my old email. I still had the receipts. Materials, labor, permits. Almost $28,000 over 2 years documented, because I am an engineer and engineers document things. I didn't know yet what I would do with that information, but I put the folder on my desktop and I didn't move it. I started looking at apartments on my own. There was a complex on Birchfield Road, 3 miles from town, managed by a property company out of Charlotte. 1 bedroom on the 2nd floor, southern exposure, a small balcony. The rent was reasonable against my pension. I drove by twice before I called, walked the parking lot, looked up at the building for a couple of minutes like I was trying to talk myself into or out of something. I signed the lease on a Friday morning. I didn't tell my daughter until that evening. She cried. I had not expected that. Not because I thought she was hard. I knew my daughter. I loved my daughter. But because the crying felt incongruous with the conversation she'd stood behind 6 weeks earlier without saying a single word. She said she hadn't meant it to go this way. I asked her what way she had meant it to go. She didn't have an answer for that. My son-in-law was not home that evening. I noticed. I moved out on a Sunday. My son drove down from Raleigh and we loaded the truck in 4 hours. Not much to move from a 1-room apartment, but it filled the bed. The drafting table barely fit. We tied it down with ratchet straps and drove slow. When we pulled out of the driveway, I looked in the side mirror. The house was already dark. No one came out to wave. My son didn't say anything for the first mile. Then he said I should have come sooner. I told him there was nothing he could have done. He said that wasn't the point. The Birchfield apartment was quiet in a way the garage apartment had never been. Through the garage apartment walls I'd heard the children at night. Small sounds, feet on hardwood, the particular knock of a toy against a baseboard. I hadn't realized how much I'd oriented myself around those sounds until they were gone. The first week I ate cereal for dinner twice. Not because I couldn't cook, because cooking for one requires a decision to do so, and some evenings the decision didn't come. I replaced the coffee maker. New one, 7 minutes faster. I put my wife's photograph on the windowsill again. Same position, slightly different light. I hung nothing else on the walls for the first 2 weeks. Not sulking, processing. There's a difference, though, from the outs. Understand they can look identical. At the end of that second week, I got a call from a man named Gideon Park. He'd gotten my number from a colleague I'd worked with at the engineering firm, who'd heard I was retired and available for consult work. A small municipality in the next county was having trouble with a stormwater drainage project. Would I be willing to take a look? I said I would. It wasn't glamorous. An afternoon in a field with rubber boots and a grade rod, looking at a drainage culvert that had been installed at the wrong pitch and was backing up every time it rained. I saw the problem in 11 minutes, wrote up the correction in 2 days. Gideon paid me more than I expected and asked if I had availability for a second project in August. I did. That summer I found a rhythm. Consult work 2 or 3 days a month, enough to keep me engaged without consuming me. I started walking the Greenway Trail on weekday mornings, 6 in the morning before the heat settled in. I cooked actual dinners. I learned at 63 that I had never properly learned to make rice and spent one determined weekend fixing that. I saw my grandchildren on Saturdays. My daughter would drop them off at a park near the apartment. We'd walk the trail, get ice cream, sometimes go to the hardware store because they liked to look at the things and ask what everything was for. The younger one called a pipe wrench a robot hand. I didn't correct him. It's not inaccurate. My daughter and I didn't talk much about what had happened. There was a period of careful courtesy between us. The way it is after something has been said plainly, and you both have to figure out how to keep moving. I didn't bring it up. She didn't bring it up. We built around it. Her husband's brother was still in the house. That much I gathered from small references. He'd apparently started some kind of business venture that required use of their garage. I didn't ask for details. Then, 8 months after I'd moved out, my son called me on a Thursday night. He'd heard something through my daughter. The renovation money. Apparently, she'd mentioned it to her husband, who'd mentioned to someone, and it had come back around that I had documentation of what I'd put into the property. My son-in-law had called my daughter into a serious conversation about it. Whether I intended to make a claim, I hadn't decided. My son asked me directly, "Do you?" I told him I didn't want money from my daughter. That was true. What I wanted was harder to name. I wanted the record to be accurate. I wanted it acknowledged that what I'd given hadn't been nothing, that I hadn't been nothing. My son said, "Dad, then you need to say that." I thought about it for 2 weeks. I didn't draft an angry email. I didn't call with ultimatums. I wrote a letter, actual paper, 3 paragraphs. I told my daughter I wasn't pursuing any claim on the property. I told her I did have documentation if it was ever needed. I told her that I'd moved on and that I hoped she understood what that cost. The last paragraph I rewrote 4 times. What I settled on was this: I don't need to be owed anything. I need you to know that what I gave was real, and what happened was not mutual. I didn't choose to go. I mailed it on a Tuesday. She called that Saturday morning, 7:42. I was on the Greenway when the phone buzzed. I stopped walking and answered. She was crying again, but differently. Not the incongruous tears from the driveway. Something that sounded more like arriving at the right place after a long wrong turn. She said she'd read the letter 3 times. She said she didn't have a defense. She said her husband had pushed for it, and she'd told herself it was the right thing for the family, and she'd let herself believe that, because believing it was easier than the alternative. I asked her what the alternative was. She said that she'd failed you. I stood on the Greenway for a moment. A man on a bicycle passed me and nodded. A dog barked somewhere in the trees. I told her I didn't need her to have failed me. I needed her to stop telling the story where I left. She said she understood. I asked if her husband understood. She was quiet. Then she said, "He doesn't think he did anything wrong." I told her that was between the 2 of them to work through. That wasn't a wall I was going to walk into. Some people find accountability in their own time. Some don't. I'd learned to stop waiting in parking lots for things that weren't coming. We talked for another 20 minutes. About the grandchildren, about a small leak she'd noticed in the roof above the laundry room, about whether the older one was going to test into the gifted program at school. Ordinary things. The conversation a father and daughter have when the air between them has been cleared enough to breathe. When I hung up, I kept walking, another mile maybe. The Greenway curves through a stand of pines and comes out at a small stone bridge over a creek. I stopped there sometime. That morning I stood on the bridge for a few minutes and watched the water moving, and didn't think about much of anything, which is its own kind of peace. My son-in-law called me 2 weeks after that. I answered on the 3rd ring. He said he knew things hadn't gone smoothly. He said he hoped there were no hard feelings. That phrase, no hard feelings, as if feelings were loose items you could simply put down. I told him I appreciated the call. I didn't say more than that. Not because I was being strategic, because there wasn't more to say to a man who'd looked at what I'd built in his backyard and seen a complication. His brother moved out, eventually. My daughter told me in passing. Got an opportunity somewhere, she said. She didn't elaborate and I didn't ask. The consult work grew. Gideon referred me to a county engineer in Harnett who had a watershed project that needed an outside review. That review led to a 6-month part-time engagement. I bought a better laptop and a new set of drafting pencils and started keeping regular hours again, 7 to noon, the way I'd always worked best. On a Wednesday in March, 14 months after I'd moved out of the garage apartment, I was sitting at my drafting table working through a grade elevation problem when I got a text from my daughter. She'd seen a write-up in the county newsletter. Gideon's firm had credited me by name in a report on the watershed project. My daughter had taken a photo of the page and sent it with a single line. "I've always known you were the best at this." I put the phone down and looked at that for a while. She meant it kindly. I know my daughter. But knowing is a funny word. Knowing requires presence. Knowing requires paying attention on the hard days, and not just the ones where a newsletter lands in your mailbox and makes it easy. I texted back a short reply. Something warm, something true. I didn't say any of that other part. I didn't need to anymore. What I've learned in the 3 years since that April afternoon with the garden hose is this. Being reasonable doesn't protect you. Being useful doesn't protect you. Loving someone completely and helping them without condition doesn't mean they'll make room for you when the room gets crowded. People protect what they're afraid of losing, and they don't always think clearly about what that is until it's already gone. I'm not bitter about that. I've tried to be honest with myself about where bitterness starts and where clarity ends, and most days I think I know the difference. I still have the drafting table. It came with me from the house my wife and I shared, through the garage apartment to the Birchfield place, and now to the small house I bought last spring. One story, a proper yard, a porch where I drink my coffee before the neighborhood wakes up. I put my wife's photograph in the front room where the morning light hits it at 9 o'clock. I've learned to make rice. I've learned other things too, smaller and less nameable. My grandchildren come on Saturdays. The older one asks questions about how buildings stay up, which I take as professional encouragement. I tell him more than a 7-year-old probably needs to know, and he listens anyway. The younger one still calls a pipe wrench a robot hand, and I have quietly decided that's correct and permanent. There are men who believe that asking for nothing means they'll never have to defend anything. I used to be that man. What I know now is that silence doesn't protect you from revision. The story of your life will be told by someone. Make sure you're one of them. My name is Warren Slade. I'm 66 years old. I signed a deed I didn't have to sign, fixed a gutter I didn't have to fix, and was asked to leave a property that would not exist in its current form without me. That is an accurate account of what happened. Not embellished, not reduced, accurate. That's the only version I'm interested in carrying.